At New York University, and I'm here to offer a warm welcome to Congressman Nadler, Comptroller Stringer, and this terrific audience. I can't tell you how lucky, fortunate NYU feels to be in the district of Congressman Nadler. We are. He gets to represent Columbia and NYU. We don't ask him to choose sides. I will just mention in passing that both his wife and his son have degrees from NYU, but I'll just leave it there. But you couldn't ask for a more devoted, smart, fierce advocate for the issues that an institution of higher education cares about. From student aid to research funding, across the board, Congressman Nadler has been there for us and the entire sector. These days, that's a great source of comfort, I'll put it that way. Ever since his election in 1992, he has kept a lot of the interests of all of us foremost in his mind. And I wanted to, on this occasion, offer him congratulations on his recent ascension to the post of ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. And obviously that position puts him in a place to really put into effect his great legislative acumen and passion for issues like criminal justice reform, protecting women's rights, consumer advocacy, and holding the administration accountable on behalf of all New Yorkers. Because there's no one who knows his way around the U.S. Constitution like Congressman Nadler. So with that, a welcome to all of you, and now it is my distinct honor to turn the podium over to someone else who's been a good friend to NYU in many of his capacities, previously as borough president and now a great city controller, Scott Stringer.
Well, good evening, everybody. It is a real pleasure tonight to introduce someone who I have known for so many years, someone I worked for, someone I learned from, and somebody who I believe will protect us from the terror called Donald Trump. And Jerry Nadler always taught me that honesty and integrity and helping people in government was something that was paramount to anyone who would be honored to hold elective office. He is somebody who has always, always done the right thing. As our representative, we have never had to worry one day, 1 second, where he stood on issues. And when we did have questions, we always went to Jerry to find the way. We need his leadership in Washington more than ever. We need his ability to make sure that we use the Constitution for us, not against us. And I want you to know, and I know Jerry feels strongly about this, in the Comptroller's office, we have done two things to think locally while we have Jerry act globally. The first thing is we have now begun a divestment of fossil fuels in the city of New York, and we have fully now divested from the private prison industry. And you see, you learn what to do when you have a good mentor. And now I am proud to introduce the future, just a few short months, the future chair of the Judiciary Committee of the United States Congress, and someone I believe will be having the most important hearings of our lifetime, Congressman Jerry Nadler.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I must say that I have 3 universities on the west side of Manhattan in my district. Columbia at the top, Fordham in the middle, NYU down here. I was an undergrad, my BA is from Columbia, my law degree from Fordham. My wife's BA is from City College. Her MA and MPhil from Columbia, her MBA from NYU. Our son's BA is from Columbia and his law degree from NYU. So we have given ample business to the colleges on the west side of Manhattan. And my wife, I forgot to mention, teaches at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia. So we've given ample connection with the three universities. I will start by shutting off my phone, actually. Beyond that, I will start by saying, by reporting, as some of you know, I was recently elected on December 20th, to be precise. I was elected as the ranking Democrat, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, which means the ranking member is the head of the minority party on the committee, and if the party becomes the majority party in the House, then the ranking committee becomes the chairman, and hopefully that will be the case in January. It was an intense 5-week campaign, but the vote was very gratifying. The Judiciary Committee is one of the most powerful committees in the House. It has jurisdiction over all criminal law, all civil rights, civil liberties, LGBT, women's rights, abortion, antitrust, immigration, civil law, so class actions, arbitrations, all patents and copyrights, and for the West Side, that's very important in music licensing, bankruptcy, constitutional law, and if there ever should be an impeachment, the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee is the locus of the impeachment hearings and votes, and you may remember that from 1973, when Peter Rodino, who's from right across the river here in New Jersey, was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and presided over those hearings and the voting of articles of impeachment against President Nixon. As you may recall, the House never voted because the president preemptively resigned. We also are in charge of election security, and we are now, I should say we are doing the following, but we're not. We have been demanding, myself, other Democrats on the committee have been demanding of the chairman that we hold hearings on oversight over the Trump administration, on all different things, that we hold oversight on the investigation into collusion with the Russians into the hacking of our elections last year, that we hold hearings, emergency hearings. We just wrote a letter to the chairman a week ago. You know, the Russians attacked our election. There's no question about that. The Attorney General says so, the FBI Director says so, the head of the CIA says so, all 17 intelligence agencies. Why we have 17 intelligence agencies is another question, but all 17 intelligence agencies of the United States all concur that the Russians interfered in our election. Whether they interfered in a way so as to change the result is unknowable, but they certainly tried. And we are told that they actually hacked into the systems of, or tried to hack into the election systems of 21 states, and actually penetrated into a few of them. How many, we don't know. The agency may know, but they haven't told us, but a few is a plural. We are told also that they are continuing to do this. We saw they just hacked into and had a great effect, arguably switched the result in the election in the Czech Republic about a week and a half ago. It didn't get a lot of coverage here, but it was very clear. And they will probably try to do the same thing in the 2018 election and the 2020 election. And when I say attack an election, there are several ways you can attack an election. One way is to literally hack into the computers and alter the results. Now, we have in New York, because we fought a battle that no one remembers 20 years ago, some of us won that battle, we do not have electronic voting in New York. We have electronic counting in New York, but those, you know how you vote, those paper ballots are there in case of a dispute or a question. There are some states and some jurisdictions where when you vote, it's registered electronically. There is no paper ballot. And the machine gives you a result at the end of the day, as our election scanners do, but you have to trust that. And if someone hacked into that machine and changed the result, if they did it skillfully enough, and if they had the good enough technology, you may not even know they did it. And I remember the arguments 20 years ago 25, in the early 1990s, well, our technology is so good, we have all these algorithms, no one can do that. And I remember arguing, and I wasn't the only one, there were a lot of other people on the same side saying, wait a minute, the history of warfare tells you, looking back thousands of years, the history of warfare tells you that sometimes the offense is predominant and sometimes the defense is predominant. So you may have the greatest algorithms to protect your machine now. Tomorrow they'll develop a new offensive algorithm and they'll be able to hack the machine and change results. You won't even know about it, and eventually you'll come up with an answer to that, but you may not even know that someone put in the instruction to the machine that said disregard every third Democratic vote and destroy these instructions. So there are jurisdictions in this country which have electronic voting. We have to get rid of that. And we should be appropriating money in Congress to get rid of that quickly. We should be protecting these elections. One of the problems we have is that although everybody else not only admits but says that and affirms that the elections were attacked and that they will be attacked again, the one person who denies this happens to be the President of the United States. And maybe because he cannot face his own ego that his election may have been affected by this, or that we would admit it, he denies that this happened. Maybe it was the Russians, maybe it was the Chinese, maybe it was some 400-pound person. I don't know why he's got against 400-pound people, but some 400-pound person sitting in a bed somewhere. And we're not doing anything to protect our elections. We're not doing anything, and we have to protect our elections. There's one thing we on the Judiciary Committee are trying to do. And having just finished that part, I'll get to other things we're doing in a moment. But I want to introduce for a moment the West Side's own new Speaker of the City Council, Corey Johnson, to say a word.
Thank you, Jerry. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to come tonight to, of course, be with all of you, but I want to really just come to thank Jerry because he invited me to speak and to take a little bit of time in this important town hall. I think he deserves this, so I want to give you a little bit of history that hopefully brings tonight into context for all of you, given the recent exciting news that Jerry is now our ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee, which is huge. And he has been a leading voice on election security and working hard to ensure that our elections remain free and fair. But he was doing this work long before he became ranking member on the Judiciary Committee. Jerry has been a leading voice on pushing for civil rights, for LGBT rights, and for women's rights. And for over 30 years in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the New York State Assembly, you, Jerry, have been on the front lines in the fight for civil rights and have been a relentless defender of our country's fundamental promise of equality for all. Jerry is a vice chair and is the founding member of the House LGBT Equality Caucus. Joyce is okay with that. He was the first member of the New York Congressional delegation to support marriage equality. Long before anyone else did, Jerry was the first person in the whole congressional delegation that was there. He has been a sponsor of every single major piece of LGBT civil rights legislation in the last 20 plus years in the House. Every single piece that's ever gone before the House, Jerry was a trailblazer in that regard. He has been staunchly committed to due process rights for the accused, preventing prosecutorial overzealousness and misconduct, and advocating against the use of illegal torture methods in this country, on the cutting edge of that as well. And last but not least, Jerry has been a huge voice on transportation issues, talking about public and mass transit. His entire career has been about fighting for the long-term infrastructure needs of New York City with his seat on that key committee. And so I am really, really proud that he and I get to do this work together. I'm proud that he's our representative for the 10th Congressional District, which includes my city council district. And I'm really also glad to have him as a partner in all the fights that our city is involved with right now. And lastly, I want to just end with this story. December 20th, Jerry knows the story already. December 20th, less than 2 months ago, I was in my district office on West 30th Street in Chelsea, and I was told the news was coming down on who the next speaker of the city council was going to be. And I was, I'll be honest, having a panic attack. And I found out around 11:30 that morning that things had come together and I was going to be the next speaker of the council. And at that exact moment in time, 11:30 in the morning, was the moment that the House Democratic Caucus elected Jerry Nadler to be the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. And so I am proudly from the Jerry Nadler political family. I am proudly someone who has been a mentee of Jerry Nadler's long before I was elected official. So for these very important moments in my career and in Jerry's career, and I hope for the city of New York and my being speaker, and for the United States of America, for Jerry being the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, both of those moments literally came together in synchronicity on the moment of December 20th. And so it was a big day for the west side of Manhattan. It was a big day for the city of New York. And it was a big day, at least for Jerry, and for our country, for the United States of America. We are so lucky to have Jerry as our member of Congress. We are so lucky for all that he has done over his entire career in public service. And let's hope that we take the House back so that Jerry is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And I know this is not supposed to be a super political event, and Jerry may not say this, so I'll say it. We are lucky to live in New York City. For those of us who live in Manhattan, we're lucky to live in Manhattan. For those who live in Brooklyn, we're lucky to live in Brooklyn. But let me say this. Do not sit idly by hoping that the election turns out okay this November. Because many of us woke up in the morning, the day after the election in November of 2016, thinking, what else could we have done to prevent this from happening? Every single one of us, I think, felt that way. If you go to northern New Jersey, there's a swing congressional district, Leonard Lance, a Republican. We have to take him out. You go to the Hudson Valley, John Faso, 35 minutes on Metro North. We have to take him out. You go out to the east end of Long Island, Lee Zeldin, owned by the NRA. We have to take him out. And so none of us should feel complacent. Oh, we live in Jerry's district, so life is grand, Jerry's fabulous, and we're all doing okay. Each one of us from now to November has to volunteer and phone bank and organize and spend just 1 day per month from now to November. 1 day. Pick one Saturday to hop on Metro North or New Jersey Transit or Long Island Railroad. Go to a swing district, door knock, phone bank, organize, because our lives and the future of this republic depend on it. We need Jerry Nadler in the majority as chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives. That will not happen on its own. That will not happen magically. That will happen if each and every one of us who are lucky enough to live in New York City, who are lucky enough to be in Jerry's district, help him be in the majority. Our next chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, my mentor and friend, Congressman Jerry Nadler. Thank you all so much for having me here tonight.
Thank you very much, Corey. I am told, and I just want to acknowledge her, that our public advocate who's done a great job, Tish James, is here somewhere. I don't see, there she is. One of the duties of Congress is to have oversight, to hold hearings, to provide a check and a balance on what the executive branch is doing. And we should be doing that in terms of voting rights, which are being suppressed all over the country, in terms of the threat to the integrity of our elections, in terms of the suppression of civil rights in many different ways that this administration is doing, in terms of some of what they're doing on abortion rights, which I may come back to in a few minutes, and in terms of the Mueller investigation. Now, the Mueller investigation is very important, obviously, and it's important not only because of what it may lead to, but because we have to find the facts. Our election was attacked. We have to find out the facts. who in this country, in the Trump campaign, outside the Trump campaign, aided and abetted that attack. Who worked with the Russians to do that? We have some indications, but we don't really know at this point. Now, I want to make a couple of observations. There's been tremendous political back and forth, the Nunes memo, the Democratic memo, the memo that I put out a couple weeks ago. Most of that is a distraction. It's an attempt to disable and discredit and take attention away from the Mueller investigation and to discredit the results, whatever they may be. The Nunes memo is an attack and says that this whole investigation is tainted from its beginning because it began as a result of a FISA warrant, a FISA warrant against Carter Page that was not properly obtained because the courts were not given the proper information. They weren't told that some of the information on which the warrant was based was paid for by Hillary's campaign, and therefore the whole investigation is not kosher, and forget about the results, and the president says he's vindicated, etc. Now that is a whole piece of nonsense for several reasons. Number one, whatever you may believe about, first of all, the FISA warrant to surveil Carter Page did not depend just on that. The court was told adequately what it should be told. It was a fine warrant. Second of all, there were 3 warrant extensions granted. For a warrant extension to be granted, you have to show the court probable cause that the previous warrant was productive of evidence that the person being surveilled, Carter Page, is a foreign agent. So you had 4 warrants, the first one of which some of the people attack as not valid, but the next 3 completely validated, even retroactively, because 3 more were granted, each of which was granted on the basis of new evidence of Carter Page being a foreign agent. Second of all, this is irrelevant because, in any event, because the investigation we know, and the Nunes memo admits, was started months earlier as a result of somebody else, George Papadopoulos. And by the way, I must say, when I heard that George Papadopoulos, whom I'd never heard of before, was an agent of the Trump campaign, and maybe of the Russians, I said, gee, that's interesting, because I remember George Papadopoulos, probably not the same person, as the head of the Greek military junta in the early 70s. Same name, probably a different person, but both equally nefarious. Thirdly, the investigation is going on, and we'll find what it finds. And what do we know about the investigation? Not much, actually. This investigation has been admirably leak-proof. No leaks have come out of it. The only things we know... Oh, and they've also alleged that various people, various FBI agents had biases, didn't like Trump, etc., which may very well have been true. But so what? FBI agents, government employees are entitled to their political opinions. They're entitled to dislike Trump. They're entitled even to like Trump, if they want. What they're not entitled to do is to bring their personal political opinion and have it affect their work. Nobody has shown any evidence that that occurred. Nobody has shown any evidence that occurred at all. And by the way, the FBI is prohibited by law from inquiring as to the political opinions of people it wants to hire. The Justice Department, the FBI, what would we think of the Justice Department if they could ask, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat as a condition of being hired? We don't like that. It's prohibited by law. So all we know is the FBI was following the law. But all we know about the investigation, really, besides irrelevancies like the political opinions of some people working on it, are one, that 2 people have been indicted, 2 major campaign workers in the, one the former campaign manager, one the deputy campaign manager, were indicted. We know that 2 other people have pled guilty and are presumably, including the former national security advisor, have pled guilty to various crimes and are presumably, we think, cooperating with the prosecution. And we know some of the witnesses who've been invited to testify. That's all we know. On the basis of what we know, we cannot say that the investigation is being improperly handled. We cannot say that it's being properly handled. We cannot say what its conclusions are going to be. All we can say are that they're behaving properly and not leaking and doing an investigation and we can make suppositions and speculations from who was indicted and who's turned state's evidence and who we think some of the witnesses are, but we have to know that 90% of what's going on there we don't know, and we can't really characterize. And we ought to let the investigation proceed and see what it comes up with, because the subject matter of the investigation, namely a foreign power interfering in our election, we must get to the bottom of, and we must find out who colluded with that. We know there was, by the way, people say that collusion is not a crime, and that is true, but criminal conspiracy is a crime. And we know at least one crime was committed. The hacking of the Democratic National Committee and the theft of those emails is a crime. And anybody who participated in it, encouraged it, dealt with it afterwards, may very well have been part of a conspiracy to commit that crime. And by the way, it's exactly the same crime as the underlying crime in Watergate. In Watergate, they physically broke into the headquarters of the National Committee and made the mistake of leaving a doorknob taped. Here, our modern technology means they didn't physically break in, they broke into the emails. It's the same thing. They stole information. It's exactly the same underlying crime. So we're trying to lead the fight to protect the Mueller investigation against interference. And clearly the administration is trying to get, and the Republicans in Congress seem to be complicit in this, the Nunes memo being part of it, are seeming to try to take people's attention off it, throw aspersions on it, and prepare the way either to fire Mueller or to fire Rosenstein, who's Mueller's boss, who can control what Mueller does, to sabotage the investigation because they are afraid of it. So that's one thing we have to be dealing with right now and continue to deal with, because the integrity of our elections and of our government is at stake. And if we steal the integrity of our elections, if we cannot trust that the election is fair, then we cannot trust that we're being governed according to our will and that the democratic society is in fact democratic. There's nothing more important than this. Second, we have another major fight going on now, as I'm sure you're aware, about immigration. And let me just talk a minute about immigration. There are several different issues in immigration. And the dreamers, that is, these kids or young people who were brought here as youngsters, who've lived here, imagine that you were brought to this country at 6 months or 2 years of age, and you know no other country, and you're Americans, and you don't realize that there's anything different until you try to go to college. And then you can't get the scholarships, and you can't get work permits, and all of a sudden you realize you may be subject to deportation to a country you don't know, to a country whose culture you have nothing to do with, whose language you may not speak. That is the horror of what's going on. So that's one piece of it. We have to have legislation, and because the Republicans wouldn't pass legislation, the President Obama, introduced the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or something like that, DACA, to defer that. President Trump created the current crisis by eliminating that and by repealing that and saying he wouldn't do anything about it till March 5th. March 5th is coming up upon us very rapidly. Every day now, 122 of the Dreamers lose their status, lose their ability to hold a job, and come March 5th, they all will, unless we do something. So we have to do something in Congress, we hope. If you took a vote on the House floor, there are plenty of Republican and Democratic votes to pass a very good Dreamers bill. But the Speaker will not permit a bill to come to the floor, period. He says he will not permit a bill to come to the floor that President Trump won't sign. Now, the Constitution gives the President of the United States a 2/3 veto. Paul Ryan wants to give him a 100% veto, apparently. Can't vote on it. So we throughout all the perturbations of the shutdown and everything you know about, we got a debate starting in the Senate starting today. We'll see what they do. I hope they'll come out with a decent bill, but we have no guarantee that it will be received in the Senate. That will need political pressure, and we don't know. But the President wants to fundamentally change the immigration law. And let me give a little history here. The United States has always had nativist anti-immigrant movements. the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s, which was basically anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. There are quotes from Benjamin Franklin talking about we can't let the Germans in because they're going to change our customs, etc. At the end of the 19th century, and then of course you had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, no Chinese in this country, no Japanese, no Asians. At the end of the 19th century, most of the overwhelming majority of people in the United States were derived either from British or from German backgrounds. The British obviously starting with the Mayflower, and the Germans starting in the late 18th and early 19th century, and especially after the failed revolutions of 1848. But then you had large immigrations of Jews and Italians and other Eastern Europeans starting really in the 1880s, 1890s, and there was a nativist reaction against this. And in 1924, the National Origins Quota System was passed, and that governed our immigration for 40 years until 1965. National Origins Quota System was a racist anti-Semitic bill and was justified by racist anti-Semitic rhetoric in the halls of Congress in the early 20s and by eugenics. And basically what that did, and you'll see why the history is relevant in a moment, what that did was to say that we have a certain number of people we will let in each year, okay, and that we will divide that. Every country will get a quota. And every country will get that percentage of that year's legal immigration as people from that country or descended from people from that country were in the population of the United States in the 1890 census. Why the 1890 census? Well, originally it said the 1920 census. Then they changed it to 1890. Why 1890? Before the Jews and the Italians and the Eastern Europeans started coming in large numbers. And that was intended to shut off that immigration, and pretty much did. In 1923, 160,000 Jewish immigrants came into the country. In 1924, less than 10,000. It shut it off like a light bulb. The Almanac of American Politics said that had that bill not passed, probably 2 million of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis would have been safely in the United States instead. And that bill or that law is why you had things like the St. Louis turned away, and why people desperately seeking to flee Europe couldn't get into the United States. That law was on the books until 1965. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, Manny Celler being the chairman of the Judiciary Committee from Brooklyn, who was elected to Congress in 1922 and railed against passing that bill in 1924 and was still around in 1965. In fact, he served in Congress till 1972. And he was the chief House author of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, 60, 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Immigration Act of 65. That law, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, set up the basis of our immigration system today. And it got rid of the National Origins Quota System. Oh, and one of the problems with the National Origins Quota System was that if you were from, the quotas from Germany and England were large, but not used. You didn't have a lot of English people who wanted to emigrate to the United States in 1940, or a lot of Germans. So it wasn't used. But there were long waiting lists for people from Poland or Russia or other places. So in 1965 we got rid of that and substituted basically the current system. And the current system sets about half of the, we admit about 1.2 million people a year, and about half of that is based on certain criteria. We want certain people with certain skills and certain job titles and so forth, certain educations. The other half is based on family reunification. And you'll hear the president talk about, President Trump talk about chain migration. We're letting in people's fifth cousins. Nonsense. Family reunification means for an American citizen they can petition to admit their children, their parents, their spouses, and their brothers or sisters, period. Nobody else. That's for American citizens. Green card holders who are permanent residents but not citizens, only their minor children and their spouses. So you're not bringing in second cousins. So that's the basis of our immigration today. We also have now, because of problems in previous years, about 11 million people who are undocumented living in the country, many of them for 20, 30 years. There are things that you wouldn't know if you listened to the president's rhetoric. The crime rate among immigrants is substantially lower than the crime rate among native-born Americans. The entrepreneurial rate, the percentage of of people who start businesses and employ other people is far higher among immigrants. And we need immigrants for another reason. Our population is aging. Every year more baby boomers retire. Every year the ratio of working age people paying into Social Security and Medicare compared to people who are over 65 receiving Social Security and Medicare, the ratio goes down. And as that ratio goes down far enough, it's going to be very hard to maintain Social Security and Medicare and some of our other systems on a per capita basis, because each person will have to support too many other people. What is saving us from that, and by the way, if you want to see where that leads, look at Japan. Japan doesn't have immigration. They have a rapidly aging population and having real problems. Russia, too. Some of the European countries are not far behind. But the United States, our Social Security system, our Medicare, our whole system is sustained by the fact that we get immigrants. And those immigrants pay into Social Security, and they work, and they form businesses, and they pay into Medicare, and they are a very important part of the economy of the United States. And if for some reason we were to cut the number of immigrants in half, economically we would be much worse off. Now, the president's proposal is you got to get rid of this chain migration, as he calls it, this family reunification, which is simply cruel. And he wants to cut it down by about half. And basically the number of immigrants would be reduced by 40%. And he wants to get rid of the diversity visa system, lottery system, which I won't go into, but that is tiny. It's 50,000 of the 1.2 million a year. It's a good thing. He always calls it the terrible diversity visa lottery system. He never says why it's terrible. You've never heard him say what's bad about it. He just applies the adjective terrible. And what he really wants to do, if he made the changes he wants to in the system, you would have far fewer immigrants, and the immigrants would be far less from Latin America and Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the motivation for that. So we have to oppose this. And let me say one other thing before I go off immigration. We can make a deal on the Dreamers if we had to. I mean, my attitude is if the president wants to waste $20 billion building a stupid wall, and if that's the price for legalizing 1.8 million, I could pay that price. The price you can't pay is which he's demanding, which doesn't get the headlines, is to set up an internal enforcement system that every employer would have to register every employee electronically through what's called the E-Verify system, because this would give the administration the tool to deport 11 million people. So you can't morally, 11 million people who may have been here for 30 years, have American citizen husbands, wives, children, etc. You can't morally say we're going to save the Dreamers at the cost of giving the administration the tools to deport those 11 million people. Proper comprehensive immigration reform would say, okay, we'll give you the tools to keep the borders. We'll give you the tools to take care of people who overstay their visas in the future, as long as you legalize the people who are here now. And that's the proper basic bargain. But he's not talking about that. Let me talk about a couple of other things. I'm told I'm talking too long before we go to questions and answers, so I'll skip the budgets and the deficits of social services, except to say one thing. The budget the president has submitted is a budget, I mean, you know they passed this tax bill, which 83% of it goes to the top 2%, I think, of the population, creates a budget deficit an additional budget deficit of $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And of course, we got to pay for that by cutting back on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and aid to education and everything else. And that's what the president is trying to do. We cannot do that, obviously. We must have a good infrastructure, but the president's infrastructure bill is a total fraud. And it is a total fraud. It provides no new money. And the one thing I'll say is it says, okay, we're going to have $200 billion of federal money. Where are we going to get the $200 billion of federal money? By reducing existing infrastructure spending dollar for dollar. So it's zero. All right, but we'll take that $200 billion and we'll force the states and the local governments to put up the additional $1.3 trillion. And we will award grants of federal money for highways, roads, tunnels, water systems, etc., instead of the old way of making those awards on the basis of merit, how important is the project, how much does it contribute economically, and so forth and so on. You make those judgments. No, he's proposing to forget about all those judgments. There's going to be one criteria, and the criteria will be how much did the state or city or local government increase taxes or tolls in order to pay for this. The more they increase local effort, the more they increase local taxes, the more federal money we'll give them, although currently it's an 80-20 split, 80% federal, 20% local. They're going to reverse that. It'll be 80% local, 20% federal. But notice, we're going to force states to increase taxes to pay for infrastructure right after the Republican tax bill eliminated state and local tax deductibility for the purpose of making it harder for states to have high tax systems. So it's completely at odds. We're going to tell the states with high taxes, you got to lower those taxes because they're not deductible and they're going to have a bigger locational impact. But by the way, if you want federal money for highways, bridges, water systems, you got to increase your taxes. It's completely at cross purposes. I don't think that we're going to allow that program to go through. Now, we also in the Judiciary Committee, and I've been very active, obviously, on LGBT issues, on women's issues. And let me just talk a moment about women's issues, then we'll go to some questions. Women's issues break down into a number of things. I'm very glad about the Me Too movement, that finally women are coming forward, and we're as a society, we are beginning to face the question of workplace and other harassment. And we'll have to find a proper balance with that and with due process and so forth, but it's good that people are coming forward and making complaints and upending privileged people who abuse positions of power to power in government, in private industry, and whatever, to abuse women. We also have other problems. Pay equity. We were making some progress on that. Now it remains to be seen. Protections for pregnant women against workplace discrimination. I have a bill which has 150 Democratic sponsors. We had one Republican sponsor because he was retiring and retired last year. But other than that, we can't get a hearing on it. But we also have the continuing war now. The administration is doing two things that are poisonous. Number one, they're using every agency of government to try to shut down Planned Parenthood, to try to bring pressure to bear against abortions, against institutions that finance or perform abortions. We saw that they're trying to pass legislation, the 20-week abortion bill, which is completely unconstitutional, came out of our committee and passed the House. And they're doing something else that is very pernicious in the name of religious freedom. Now, religious freedom is very important, but religious freedom has to be, as I like to put it, a shield, not a sword. Religious freedom is your ability to worship as you please without the government or someone else interfering. It is not your ability to discriminate against a third party in the name of your religious view. My first year in Congress in 1993, I was one of the authors of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which we viewed as a shield, and which was used as a shield for 20 years, and now they're trying to use it as a sword. And the administration is putting out guidance that says basically that you needn't have contraception cover if you're an employer and you're giving out the health, you have health coverage pursuant to Obamacare, to the Affordable Care Act. You needn't cover abortions or contraception if that is against your sincerely held religious belief. Well, what if your sincerely held religious belief says you can't cover blood transfusions also? There are some religions which say that. What if your sincerely held religious belief says that someone over 80 shouldn't get any attention at all because we are overpopulated and it's our duty to save the world or something? I mean, people have all kinds of religious beliefs, and God bless them, they're entitled to their religious beliefs, but not to use those religious beliefs to impinge on someone else's rights. And that is what the administration is pushing in many different ways, and is also before the courts right now. I think I'll stop here. I'm not going to get into foreign policy or anything because we want time for questions. But before I take questions, I want to acknowledge our borough president, Gail Brewer. I'm told she is here in the back. The best borough president we've ever had. What? Or one of the best. I haven't canvassed in my own mind every single past one, so I shouldn't say that. Okay, other.
So, ladies and gentlemen.
And I certainly don't want to cast aspersions on Ruth Messenger.
We're going to go to the question period of time here, like a game show, right? So what we're doing, let me just give you a little bit. These comment cards, we are going to collect the comment cards. The comment cards are really, if the congressman doesn't get to your question, we are going to try to respond to your question at a later date, either on Twitter or on Facebook or email. So that's what the comment cards are. We're going to go around the room, try to take as many questions as we can. And I'm going to start with that gentleman right over there. I was pointing to that gentleman. No, I need a blank to write one. Oh, we'll get you one.
Hi, my name is Dr. Steve Auerbach. I'm with Physicians for National Health Program in the Untitled Chapter. I want to thank you for your long-time support of HR 676.
I think you have to tell people what's HR 676.
National single payer for real universal guaranteed health care for all, public universal guaranteed public health insurance, paid for through progressive taxation. I know the national movement is working behind the scenes for a new sponsor from the House, and just wanted to say thank you and hope for your continued strong support as we move forward for real universal health care.
I have been a consistent supporter of Medicare for all, or the single-payer assistance since well before I was in Congress. I want to add, by the way, Assemblyman Dick Gottfried, who represents part of the West Side, has been chairman of the Health Committee of the State Assembly for a long time, has a single-payer bill for a long time. And if the Democrats take control of the state Senate, which is a good possibility, I think we may very well become the first state in the union to show the way.
My concern is less specific to law and more specific about what's going on politically as of late. There are neo-Nazis who are running for office in 2018. There are people who, with these held beliefs of hatred. And I really want to know, because the actions of the GOP right now seem to align with what's happening with these people who are running. And I actually want to know, does it feel that way to you? Are you feeling this sense of disenfranchisement or anti-Semitism or racism, or when you're actually in the Congress? Because it's appearing that way to many of us, that if people are acting on partisan lines that are also really discriminatory lines.
I think I have to say a couple of things. There is no question that neo-Nazis and white supremacists and other such are finding it more comfortable to come out from under the rocks and to show themselves. We saw that at Charlottesville, we see that other places. And that's largely, I think, because of the rhetoric of President Trump and some of the people around him. When the President of the United States says that there were fine people on both sides of a neo-Nazi white supremacist march and the people who came to oppose them, it's almost granting permission. Having said that, I don't know that there are any more neo-Nazis or white supremacists now than there were 5 years ago. I don't know that. They're feeling more open to coming out and showing themselves, and they're in that way more threatening also. And certainly the President and the administration should be roundly condemned for giving them, in effect, permission, or a sort of permission to express in the open light, as a kosher view, so to speak, things that were way beyond the pale. And we have to fight this, obviously. I don't see much of that in the House. I mean, there are in the House certain people who have always been very clearly racist. I don't think that has changed. What's changed is the President and some people around him giving cover to people expressing these views. Someone said to me, I won't name who, is an older person who was born in Germany, came here in 1938, 39, and remembers Nazis marching in the street, said to me that when he saw Nazis marching in the street of Charlottesville, he had very bad memories. Obviously, that gives very bad memories. But there is a difference. And the difference is that when the Nazis were marching in the streets of Germany in 1938-39, there was a mass movement behind them. There was a governing political party behind them. That is not the case now. The Republicans, there may be problems with them, but they're not basically a Nazi party, clearly.
Yes, they are.
No, they're not. No, they're not. There are people within, let's be real, there are people within the Republican Party who may be racist and bad. There are people probably in the Democratic Party, too. But the party as a whole is not that far. I mean, it's a party I thoroughly disagree with, obviously, on almost everything. But we have to know what we're dealing with. You're not dealing with a mass Nazi movement in this country. You are dealing with racists and neo-Nazis and white supremacists who feel more emboldened to come out and talk because of the actions of the president and people around him. And that's something we have to reverse.
Thank you.
The way the system works is it is illegal to discriminate on national origin when they hire me and my colleagues for a job. But when it comes time to sponsor me for my green cards, because of these national origin quotas, I have to wait 7 years for a green card. As you know, there's a bill in the House called the Fairness of High Skilled Immigrants Act. It has 307 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House, 165 Democrats, including every single member on your House Judiciary Committee, including you. Thank you so much for co-sponsoring this bill. And one of the additional things with the bill is a lot of our members come in with kids, and these kids also have to leave when they hit 21. They have to self-report because they're too old to be under the parents' green card petition. So there is a compelling moral argument for this bill to be added to the DACA bill. And with 307 co-sponsors, this thing is completely uncontroversial. We have a majority of the Republicans, a majority of the Democrats, majority of every caucus from both parties on the bill. Can you pick up the phone and ask her to consider adding this?
Sure.
Thank you.
That's easy. Sure. Yes. Never let it be said I can't give you a brief answer.
I want to ask you in regards to the specific issue of human rights in China.
It's a very good question to which I do not have a good answer. We do not have a lot of leverage with China. China is a rising power. We've got problems with China on human rights, obviously. We've got problems with China on militarization of the South China Sea and building artificial islands. They have been persecuting the Falun Gong or minority for a long time. We can make representations to them. I doubt sanctions would have much effect there. So I don't really know. I mean, we can push them, and insofar as they want things from us, we can make that we can put that high on our diplomatic list. That's about all I can say at this point.
As a lawyer, also entertain the possibility that failure to enforce sanctions passed by the legislative branch is an act of dereliction of duty by the executive branch.
It is.
And by that, it's at this time not sufficient to consider in earnest hearings on impeachment of the President of the United States.
Normally, when we pass a sanctions bill, the President should impose a sanction on Iran or this one or on that one. We normally put a waiver in it. The President, if he makes certain findings, may waive this for a 6-month period. And then he may waive it again for a 6-month period. Because we did not trust this President, Congress did not include a waiver authority in the sanctions bill to sanction Russia because of their interference in the election. The bill passed overwhelmingly. It was better than 400 votes in the House. I forget how many in the Senate. And it was very clear that had he vetoed it, the bill would have passed over his veto. So he signed it. Now, I do not understand by what legal authority he simply refuses to accept the sanctions anyway. I've asked for an explanation, and we're looking into this. I'm told there may be some legal authority. I don't know what it is. But it is very clear. And I've talked to the ranking Democrat and the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee to suggest that if there's any wiggle room that he could claim on this, we should pass another bill removing wiggle room. I don't see the wiggle room, but maybe there is. But if there is, we should take care of it. But yes, failure to enforce the law. One of the president's prime duties, if you read the Constitution, is he's supposed to see that the law is faithfully executed. And deliberate failure to enforce the law is a dereliction of duty and could be considered an impeachable offense. And if you want to talk about impeachment, you're not going to talk about it, frankly, when you have a Republican House which is going to ignore everything. And to be blunt, if the Democrats take control, we will hold hearings on lots of things. And we will be finding out what their excuses on this and that and the other thing, and we'll be watching the Mueller investigation, and we'll see where things go from there.
All of these people that are using religion for the Bible, whatever, to discriminate, Trump will never say this, but Muslim people are very good people, radical Christian terrorists. This is what this regime is. It's not an administration.
What's your question?
It's a regime. Okay, this man is Hitler. I'm sorry, he's doing it in a different way, though. And my question is, what is the Democrats? The Democrats need to step up and act like a party. The Republicans have been doing it since the 1970s. Nancy Pelosi says that she's not going to impeach him. It is time to impeach him now and get the king and the
Nancy Pelosi, all right. Nancy Pelosi has not said that we are not going to impeach the president. I don't know where you got that from. She may have pointed out that as long as the Republicans have control of the House, there will be no impeachment, and that is clear. What I'm saying is, if the Republicans, God forbid, keep the House, there will be no possibility of impeachment. If the Democrats take the House, no, I won't say that either. Then we'll have to see. Then there might be. You'd have to see. And let me say this about impeachment. I have to be careful what I say, because if we have hearings on impeachment, and I'm chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I would preside at them. So I have to preserve credibility. But let me say two apparently contradictory things. One, I would dearly love to preside over the impeachment of Donald Trump. Two, I don't know that we will do that or can do that or should do that. That remains to be seen on the evidence that comes out of the Mueller investigation and out of the oversight. If the Democrats take control, we will certainly do oversight and investigations of a million different things. And if sufficient evidence of impeachable offenses comes out from the investigations that we do, from the Mueller investigation, then we may very well move to impeach. If sufficient evidence does not come out, then we just have to wait for the next election. But an impeachment could happen. I'm not saying it will, I'm not saying it won't, because we don't know. But impeachment is a very serious thing, because you are trying to, and remember, the impeachment, and I said this on the floor in 1998 when we were opposing the impeachment of President Clinton. I'll say it again now, when the shoe is on the other foot. Impeachment cannot be partisan. Impeachment cannot be partisan for two reasons. If you have a majority in the House, you can vote in impeachment. If you have, you can vote the impeachment. Whether you should is another question, but you can. But you're not going to remove the president from office without a 2/3 vote in the Senate. There's very little purpose of impeaching in the House if you get an acquittal in the Senate. Which means, for simple arithmetic, you will need some Republican, not a lot maybe, but some Republican support in the Senate to complete the impeachment and have a removal. That's one of the two reasons. But there's a second reason. And that is a second reason why impeachment cannot be purely partisan. And that is, if you're really going to remove the president, and there's no point starting an impeachment if you don't intend to do that. You had better intend to do that if you start an impeachment. If you're really going to remove the president from office, you are in one sense nullifying, repealing the last election. And you may have to do that. The Constitution may require it, protecting of liberty may require it, you may have to. But you had better be able to think that by the end of the process, not the beginning, but by the end of the process, you will have convinced some appreciable fraction, not a majority, but some appreciable fraction of people who voted for Trump, that you had to do it, that is justified. Because if you can't, you will tear the country apart. For the next 20 or 30 years, you will have recriminations We won the election and you stole it from us. And you don't want to tear the country apart like that. So now you don't have to have that buy-in at the beginning of the process, but you have to have enough evidence, enough grounds so that you think it is quite likely that by the end of the process, when all the information has come out, when all the evidence has come out, when all the evidence of the crimes or whatever has come out, that you get enough buy-in so that it's not a purely Democratic, purely partisan impeachment. If you have that, you can and should impeach the president. If you don't, you shouldn't.
Thank you so much, and thank you to your wonderful staff. Can you please talk to us about climate change and impact and resiliency and the status of the storm surge barrier? Thank you.
Well, climate change doesn't exist. Never did, never will. I got that straight from the president last time I spoke to him. Obviously, it is a very serious problem, and it is inevitable. And even if we do everything we're talking about doing to keep the average temperature from rising more than 2 degrees, there will be very, very severe impacts. We're already seeing those severe impacts. The wildfires in California, the extra strong storms all across the country. The war in Syria is partially controlled by the fact that an increasing percentage of Syria is desert and people are being driven off the land. That's happening in Africa too. And God forbid the permafrost melts. You're beginning to see, by the way, in Alaska, the highways are built on permafrost. And they depend on the permafrost. They're beginning to buckle. So the climate change is inevitable, and we have to limit it as much as we can. And there are going to be very unfortunate consequences, and it's too late to stop those unfortunate consequences, but it's not too late to minimize and mitigate them. But we have a president who won't admit the possibility, and who literally is like an ostrich with his head in the sand. They're cutting the research budgets. They don't want it, they don't want, for NASA and for the National Ocean, or NOAA, National Oceanographic, whatever it is, administration. They're cutting the research budgets. They don't want to know. All because in the service of fossil fuels. We have to fight that, obviously. But no matter how we fight that, and hopefully we'll have a president a few years from now and an administration that will resume the fight in real terms. And by the way, states like New York and California and other states are largely picking up the slack from the federal government. They can't do it all, but they can do a lot of it, and they are. And God bless Governor Brown of California, who's really leading the way in this. In a much earlier period in his life, they called him Governor Moonbeam, but he knew what he was talking about. But we have the Army Corps of Engineers studying the New York region, the New York Bight, the New York area, for resiliency. They're going to come out with a report, I'm not sure when, but not in the near future. And they will recommend what we can do or what the various options are for the various costs. And yes, I think a storm surge barrier is a wonderful thing. It costs billions. Had a lot of construction jobs. But whether we do a storm surge barrier or not, there are a lot of things you can do for resiliency, for making New York more resistant, more able to bear it. It's going to cost money, and some people are going to get hurt. And our job is to minimize the latter. And we're waiting for the report from the Army Corps of Engineers that we funded, and that's going on right now.
But what can we do now to try to save jobs and the protection for jobs until we get in, take the House back, take the Senate back, so we can stop some of these rules? What can we do, what can you do on your committee and in the House to begin to try to hold a lot of the rules going through that are hurting us and the families of working people, men and women in this country?
Well, the question isn't really what we can do to protect jobs. We have a very low unemployment rate right now. The question is that jobs aren't paying what they ought to. I remember in my first year in Congress, there was a huge debate over NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I came in not knowing anything about it. I ended up voting against it, and I'm very glad I did. But one of the arguments turned out to be totally wrong. If we passed NAFTA, for some reason, productivity in Mexico would go up. And if productivity in Mexico, I don't remember why NAFTA would cause productivity in Mexico to go up, but that was the assertion. And everybody knows that if productivity goes up, wages go up in tandem with productivity, and therefore the Mexican wages would go up and they would provide less downward pressure on American wages. That was the argument. What has happened is that what everybody took for granted then, and by the way, productivity didn't go up in Mexico, it's a separate problem, but had it done so, everybody took for granted then that if productivity went up, wages would go up. And that had been true for 50 years. That if you graphed productivity and wages, they went in tandem. That hasn't been true in the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, productivity has gone way up in this country, wages have been stagnant. And where did the benefits of the productivity go? To the top 1% or 2% of the population. So if you look at major corporations today, I forget the statistics, but a much higher percent of the income of those corporations goes to profits and shareholders than it used to be the case, and a much lower percent goes to wages and workers than used to be the case. Partly that's because of the decline of unions, partly maybe due to other economic factors. But the real question is not how to get more jobs. That's not the problem now. Maybe it'll be the problem 5 years from now, but it's not the problem right now. The problem is, how do you get more of the benefits of productivity and the benefits of an expanding economy to the workers? And there are any number of theses on that, one of which obviously is you have to re-empower unions. You have to re-empower unions. And I think when I was a kid, 30%, 40% of American workers were in unions. Today in the private sector, it's like 6%, 5%. And they have no bargaining power because the factory threatens to move abroad, which is one of the problems with NAFTA and a few other things. And the other thing is, of course, we don't enforce our labor laws. If you try to organize a union, you'll be fired. It's illegal, but you'll be fired. And what will happen, maybe 10 years later, the company will be forced to pay you back wages. Not triple, just back wages. It's the cost of doing business. Now, we had legislation years ago during the Carter administration, and again at the beginning of the Clinton administration, and I think the labor movement and the Democrats as a whole made a mistake. And that was the car check legislation. That you could organize the union without an election and giving the employer the opportunity to pressure everybody and so forth and so on, just by having 50% of the cards signed. And that was susceptible to being attacked by the right as anti-democratic. You were afraid of elections. And we lost those battles. I think a better approach is a bill that a couple of us introduced. It's a Keith Ellison, John Lewis, Jerry Nadler bill. And it starts off with the observation that if you are a corporation and you fire a person because the person is the wrong race or sex, the law will come down on your head like a ton of bricks. But if you fire a person because he's exercising his rights to talk to his co-workers about a union, nothing will happen. So what this bill does is it simply takes all the enforcement mechanisms of the Civil Rights Act and puts it into the National Labor Relations Act. So it doesn't deal with union elections. It doesn't say you don't have to have an election. But it says if you pressure workers improperly, the law will come down on your head, exactly as if you're violating the Civil Rights Act and not the National Labor Relations Act. That's, I think, a better approach. It's something that, if we take control, we're going to push very, very hard. And it's one approach. There are other approaches, too, that we have to do. But, the federal government can use procurement power to encourage proper labor practices, to encourage unionization. Under this administration, it's doing the opposite. And part of the president's infrastructure bill is to do away with Davis-Bacon, to do away with every protection you can imagine. It's trying to go in exactly the wrong direction. And also, if we get enough political power, we should repeal section whatever of the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which enables states to pass right-to-work laws. We should not have right-to-work laws in this country.
You spoke earlier about human rights in China not having been leveraged. I'd like to talk about another human rights issue. I'm a New Yorker of Jewish background. Many of us have different feelings about Israel. We may not agree, but there are systemic human rights violations going on there against children in the West Bank, and these have been well documented by organizations such as UNICEF and Human Rights Watch. Israel arrests, detains, and prosecutes more than 700 Palestinian children each year in the West Bank, and they're subject to torture. They're not given due process, right? So there's a bill that your colleague Betty McCollum has introduced, HR 4391, promoting human rights by ending Israeli military detention of Palestinian Children Act, right? And we support Israel.
What would the bill do?
The bill would ensure that Israel is not committing human rights violations with our money. And so, as a country that gives a lot of money to Israel, we have the opportunity to have leverage over these human rights violations. So I hope you would consider supporting this bill, which 21 of your colleagues have already supported. And thank you so much.
I'll take a look at the bill, but I asked you what it did, and all you said is it encourages. I mean, firstly, the question is, what does the bill do? And I don't know, and I wasn't told. But let me say this, the problem there is much more complicated than you just said. Israel does arrest Palestinian teenagers and 12-year-olds because they are accused, and I can't guarantee that the accusation is always right, but they're accused of stabbing people and attacking them. And there is this big problem of terrorism, of individual terrorism, individual stabbings, including by teenagers and kids as young as 11 and 12. So to simply say that Israel is arresting youngsters, to say that there's something wrong with that, you have to show that it's arresting youngsters who in fact haven't given cause to arrest by physically attacking somebody else. From a legal point of view, the League of Nations in 1925 established the right of Jews to settle anywhere in mandatory Palestine, which includes what is today called Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And I don't know of what agency or when that right was revoked. So I am opposed to the settlements, not because I think it violates, the settlement being there violates anybody's rights, but because the world needs, Israel needs, the Palestinians need a two-state solution, and the settlements make a two-state solution much harder. The situation is far from one-sided. One basic underlying problem is that the Palestinians have absolutely refused to negotiate with the Israelis since 2010, absolutely refused to meet with them, absolutely refused to talk with them. There was an offer, there were two offers, one in 2001 by Prime Minister Barak, and the other in 2008 by Prime Minister Olmert, the 2008 offer was you can have a Palestinian state in 100% of Gaza, 96% of the West Bank, and we'll give you territory from Israel proper, so it'll be equivalent acreage up to 100% of the West Bank. You'll have part of Jerusalem as your capital. Israel will keep part of Jerusalem as its capital, and the Holy Basin, that is the Temple Mount, and et cetera, will have some sort of individual, some sort of separate sovereignty. That was rejected outright, and no counter-proposal was made. Palestinians made no counter-proposal in 2001. They made no counter-proposal in 2008. Abbas said about a year ago that I rejected it outright because I expected Prime Minister Olmert to be indicted, which he was. But so what? The government made a proposal, you react to the proposal. The Palestinians have absolutely refused to negotiate, and a lot of the blame for the fact that there's no solution rests on them. A lot of the blame rests on the Israelis for insisting on the settlements. But also, don't forget, you had in 2001 to 2004 the Intifada, where over 1,000 Israelis were murdered by terrorists, many coming from the West Bank into Israel proper. You still have terrorism. You also now have the phenomenon of some Jewish terrorism against the Arabs, which is unfortunate but real. But it's not a one-sided situation at all.
Thank you. Hi, I'm over here. My name is Samsara Taylor, and I'm part of RefuseFascism.org. And I want to echo the brother over there who said this is a regime that we're facing, the Trump-Pence regime.
and it is a fascist regime. Now, you said impeachment and overturning an election is a very serious matter. And I would say no election, fair or fraudulent, can justify acquiescing to a fascist America in the name of humanity. You said that it would tear the country apart to do impeachment without enough buy-in. I will ask a question. I will say, though, that logic would have said, let's stay with slavery rather than have a civil war. That logic would have opposed the civil rights movement. Those are movements where there is still recrimination. That's what the Trump-Pence regime is. There's a direct line from Trump to the Confederacy, and we all know it. So here's my question and my last comment. You say there wouldn't be enough buy-in, and I would challenge all of us in the room. If the people who see with clear eyes the danger to humanity posed by this regime went into the streets and made a demand, night after night, day after day, the regime must go, this nightmare must end, in the millions, and stayed in the streets, would that or would that not change the calculation of many of those sitting in the halls of power in a way that would not happen if people sit home and just hope that people like you, who I know don't like Trump and Pence, I know are different, but your calculations are what's going to hold this empire together. Our calculations need to be what is going to stop a fascist America in the name of humanity.
I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll answer it anyway, or I'll comment on it. The fantasy that having mass demonstrations in the streets will overthrow the regime is A, a fantasy, and B, an anti-democratic, one could almost say fascist fantasy. One doesn't overthrow an elected government by force or by demonstrations. Now, demonstrations may be very useful. Indeed, they may be essential to shape public opinion so that the elected officials can be stronger, can do an impeachment if necessary, etc. But if we're going to remove Trump, it's going to be by one of two means, either by defeating him in the next election or by impeaching him and getting a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and it's not by having riots in the streets. Now, as I said, the demonstrations in the streets I'm not, excuse me, demonstrations, I have been at my share of demonstrations since my days as an anti-war organizer in the Vietnam War. And demonstrations are very important, but they're only important ultimately insofar as they lead to electoral change, because that's the way you get change done. Now, a demonstration may persuade... Demonstrations may help change public opinion, they may help influence elections, but the demonstration itself cannot overthrow a government, and if it could, that would be not anarchy necessarily, but that would be anti-democratic. You don't want that.
We talked about the legislative and executive branches. I want to know about the judicial branch. Well, I'm very concerned about these recent judicial appointments for really unqualified individuals. I'm also worried about Gorsuch and his conversations with senators. That doesn't seem legal to me. Is there anything you guys can investigate here?
The question is a very good question, but it's not so much. I'm less worried about unqualified nominees. There are unqualified nominees. The Republic will survive them. Some individual litigants may be harmed by them. I'm more concerned about the fact that Trump has farmed out all his nominations to the Federalist Society and is trying to pack the courts with far right-wing extremists. And until we change either the President or the Senate, which hopefully will be this November, he's going to get away with it. I mean, they blocked Merrick Garland, and they blocked a lot of Obama's nominees for the circuit courts of appeals and the district courts, and they had a lot of vacancies, and they're pushing large numbers of right-wing ideologues through. We have not seen this. Democrats did not, when Obama was president, when Clinton was president, what were the comments about judicial appointments? Well, he's well qualified. Or, a woman or a black. We're integrating the judiciary. It wasn't, and those are good things, but it wasn't, another committed leftist. They didn't farm out they used more traditional means. We'd like good, decent people. Who does Senator McGillicuddy recommend? They didn't farm it out to some far-left organization, which is what Trump has done. And it's going to do tremendous damage to the courts, tremendous damage probably to our liberties, because they'll be very constrained in how they interpret it, and we have to put a stop to it as soon as possible.
Congressman Nadler, my name is Jack Hammond. I work with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and we are very concerned about the danger of war with North Korea, specifically nuclear war. We know that you have supported the H.R. 4837, no unconstitutional strike against North Korea, forbidding the president to strike against North Korea on his own initiative without consulting with Congress. And we're very grateful for that support. I think that right now, where there's a pause, the Olympics, where we don't have the juvenile provocation from the two countries' leaders, we acknowledge that North Korea has been very provocative and it's not easy to deal with them, but we need to calm down the situation, and particularly at this time, I think it's a good time to push the Democratic leadership to sign on to the Rocana Bill 4837. And I'd like to ask you what you can do and what we can do to bring that about.
Well, I agree with you totally. I am very concerned about Trump getting us into a war. In fact, somebody asked me a month or so ago, if we could impeach Trump, would we be better off with Pence? And I thought for a moment, and I said yes, for two reasons. One of which is that I think Pence is a lot less likely to get us into a war than Trump is. And I very much worry about Trump. And of course I support the 4837, the Rocana bill. But I don't think we need the bill, frankly. I mean, yes, we ought to have it, but I don't think it is necessary. As a matter of constitutional law, the president has no power to initiate a war without a vote of Congress. He can't simply, now they've been doing it. Presidents have been getting away with this for a long time. I was very critical of the President Trump attacking Syria with those rockets without any congressional action. I was very critical of President Obama attacking Libya in 2012 without congressional action. And I was critical of that because I thought it was not a bright thing to do for a lot of regular foreign policy reasons. But as a matter of constitutional law, I didn't think he had any right to do that. I don't think Trump had any right to attack Syria without congressional authorization. And I don't think there's any right to attack North Korea now. Having said that, they're going to do what they want to do. And the system is badly out of kilter. And Congress, I don't know how we prevent the president from doing that, other than passing a bill specifically, which is why I'm supporting it. But I don't think we ought to need such a bill. I think it's, the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The president is not the commander-in-chief of the country, although he's often referred to as commander-in-chief. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces when executing a war declared by Congress, or in modern parlance, an authorization for the use of military force.
A couple of things that have been mentioned. I was glad that the speaker brought up different congressional races that we might get involved in, given that we are lucky to live in a place where we feel safe, but we can go other places.
My campaign office, which you can call, it's in the phone book, it's online. They can answer that question, but we can't do that here. That would be a violation of a lot of things. If we had control of the House, never mind the Senate, certainly both, the Constitution envisions the Congress as a check on the executive, and in fact, all three branches are supposed to be checks and balances against each other. The problem is, the framers didn't anticipate the development of the political parties and the temptation of a political party in control of the House of Congress to go easy on their president. Nonetheless, over American history, we've had checks and balances even on the president of your own party, but not now. We've been critical of the Republicans in control of the House for not holding hearings on a million different things. If Congress were functioning properly, and certainly if the Democrats took control, I would hope it would function properly. But if Congress were functioning properly, we would have hearings in which we would drag down the the secretary or the commissioner and say, why aren't you doing this? How do you justify doing that? And it'll be open to the light of day. And if necessary, we would draft legislation or put riders in appropriations bills to force their hand to say, you can't do this, you must do that. As it is, Congress is being totally supine, but that's a political choice. And I can guarantee you, if the Democrats were in charge, certainly the Judiciary Committee and other committees would be holding those hearings. We'd probably break up into subcommittees and hold more hearings, get this all out into the light of day, develop the support for legislation or for provisions in the appropriations bill that tell you what you can and cannot do. I'll tell you one very quick story as to how this kind of thing can work. In 1942, President Roosevelt called in Senator McKellar of Tennessee, who was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And he said, Senator, I need you, this is 1942, the middle of World War II. He says, Senator, I need you to vote a $2 billion appropriation, which is huge in those days, a $2 billion appropriation for a secret war project, and I cannot tell you anything about what it is. But you must vote the $2 billion. And McKellar looked at Roosevelt and he said, yes, sir, just tell me where in Tennessee we're going to build it. And that's why Oak Ridge National Laboratory is in Tennessee. The point is, he could put conditions. And you could still do that today. If you had a Congress or a House that was willing to do that, you put a condition in the appropriations bill. You may not do this, you must do that. You must report back in 3 months, whatever.
Back to Mueller, what do you think the likelihood is of Trump getting rid of him? And if so, put the kibosh on the investigation for how long? Can it be revived? And hopefully with the idea that the Democrats take back Congress in 2018.
Well, I can't estimate the odds of that happening, but let me say one thing. The president cannot fire Mueller. Only Rosenstein can fire Mueller. The president, however, can fire Rosenstein. And whoever replaces him could then fire Mueller or could place constraints on what Mueller is doing, because the Attorney General, who ultimately controls the process, the Attorney General is recused, so it's the Deputy Attorney General, which is to say Rosenstein. Which is why in the memo that I wrote, that we put out as a reply to the Nunes memo. Remember, the Intelligence Committee Democrats put out their own memo, which is still secret, etc. But we put out our memo from the Judiciary Committee, which was not secret, because we didn't put secret information in it or base it on. It was a refutation of the Nunes memo. And one of the things we put in there, we made 4 points, which I'm not going to go into now, unless someone asks me. But we made 4 points. I'm not urging that. We made 4 points, one of which was that the Nunes memo gives no excuse for firing Rosenstein, because we were afraid that they were going to use that as an excuse, because Rosenstein signed off on the last of the Fisa renewals. And they made a big deal about how the first Fisa renewal, first Fisa warrant was improper, which I don't agree with, but they said it was improper. And then they said, Rosenstein signed off on the renewal. Okay, they didn't make the case that that was a terrible thing, they just sort of implied it. So we put in our memo, he did nothing wrong. Had he not signed off, he would have been accused properly of a political act. And we did that specifically because we wanted to protect Rosenstein and Mueller. What would happen if they actually fired Rosenstein and or Mueller? I don't know. Hopefully the country, hopefully the country would arise in fury, and we would have hearings, and we'd find a way of reinstating it, and he would have to back down, and we'd reinstate, as happened after the Saturday Night Massacre. Remember, after the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon asked the Attorney General to fire Archibald Cox. He said no and resigned. He then asked the Deputy Attorney General, Ruckelshaus, to fire Cox. He said no and was fired. He then asked the, what? Resigned, okay. Excuse me. He then asked the Solicitor General, the third ranking person in the department, a fellow named Robert Bork, who we later heard of for other reasons, to fire Cox, and he said yes and fired Cox. And the reaction was so intense that within, I think, a few days or a week or two, a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, was appointed and did an honest and admirable job. So we don't know.
Congress was not Republican the way it is now, correct?
That is true, but Congress, I don't think took any formal action. There was just a lot of talking and screaming. I don't think Congress passed a bill or a resolution or anything to force a new special prosecutor.
So within Congress, you think that there could be a similar reaction? Why can't you-
There would be a very severe reaction. What the result of that would be, I can't say. I don't know. I hope it would be a very severe. I think it would be a very severe reaction, but it couldn't be just in Congress. The country would have to, and I think the good odds the country would really rebel and rise up and force the appointment of a new special prosecutor. I would hope that would be the case, but I don't know that. Nobody does.
When will you start establishing oversight over the judiciary branch of the government?
Well, the oversight of the judiciary branch of the government is a two-edged sword, because you want the judiciary to be independent and not subservient to the president or to Congress. They're an independent branch, and we depend on them to be independent, usually for bribery of some sort. But a judge who does something really terrible can be impeached and removed from office, and that has happened 17 times. Although, to impeach a judge because if you don't like his decision is very, very, not difficult. It should be difficult, but I'm not sure we ought to do that.
My question goes to Puerto Rico. I'm going to make it really short. What is your office doing? New York is heavily impacted by what's happening in Puerto Rico, as is Florida. But New York, so how are you envisioning the path forward for Puerto Rico out of your office?
Well, we have supported and worked closely with Nydia Velasquez in particular. I work very closely with Nydia and Joe Serrano, but more with Nydia, on securing aid for Puerto Rico. The bill we just passed does supply a lot of aid. I forget the exact amount, but for the first time, a very significant amount for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And we'll continue to monitor that and to push that.
The House just passed the concealed weapon right to carry across states. What's the likelihood of that passing the Senate, of it becoming law? And what does that mean for New York and other states that ban the guns?
We passed, I shouldn't say we, I voted against it, obviously. And that came through the Judiciary Committee. I led the opposition to it. And what this bill says is essentially is that the law of the state from which issued governs. So if Texas has no standards and you can put a gun in your pocket in Texas, you can carry that gun into New York no matter what New York's laws may say. That's what this bill says. I pointed out that this was the second attempt to my knowledge, to use the power of the federal government to export the law of state A into state B. Not to impose federal law in a state, we do that all the time, but to use federal power to import the law of one state into another. There have been 2 attempts to do that. Actually, there have been 3 attempts to do that. The first one was successful. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1852. We don't think that was a very good idea. We had an abortion bill a few years ago that tried to do that, that was defeated. This bill passed the House. I do not believe it's going to pass the Senate. I think, again, in the Senate, you need for something like this 60 votes because of the Democrats, and they won't get it. The oversight of the judiciary branch is twofold. 1, the higher courts, and 2, we can impeach judges, and we have 17 times, I think.
I've been at the office many times. I'm very concerned about already how Social Security is being diminished. It has been all for the past couple of years, and the effects on us all. How are we going to fight against that?
There's no magic answer to that question. We're going to fight against it by opposing anything in the law that would change it and anything in appropriations that would change it. And we're going to try, and again, being in the minority, we have very little leverage. In fact, we have almost no leverage. But we're going to do what we can, and if we get the majority, then we can go in the other direction. Elections really do have consequences.
So my question is, do you support a national election day, a day off that would allow people to vote?
Yeah. Yes. And there are a lot of things we can and should do to make voting easier, and that's one of them.
Do you support enfranchisement of DC citizens who basically at this moment have no representation in Congress or?
Yes, I support that. I think I support DC statehood, and certainly anything in between.
Impeachment. Twice you voted to table Representative Green's call for impeachment, and my question to you is, first, why isn't it okay to have a bill, impeachment, come up and fail just to put pressure and to get the truth out by having hearings? And second, in your mind, what needs to happen before you will support impeachment other than Democrats winning the majority in Congress?
Well, you have to understand the following. Al Green proposed a resolution of impeachment. The motion is made to refer to committee. The motion is then made to table the motion to refer. And that's what the vote is. If the motion, I voted to table the motion to refer, which passed. If the tabling had not passed, you then refer it to committee where there would be no hearings and it would die immediately. There's no practical import to voting one way or the other on that, because the motion to refer to committee is a motion to send it to the Judiciary Committee where the Republicans would bury it and that would be the end of it. So there's no practical impact. But I voted to table because I do think you cannot justify at this point sending the bill, an impeachment resolution to committee, which is going to kill it right away. Or actually, it's not going to kill it, it's just not going to act on it. It's just going to sit there and do nothing and give people the impression that you're doing something. You're not doing anything. To have anything happen, you would refer it to a committee which would act, which is to say not in this Congress. Hopefully in January, we'll have a different committee and the committee could consider it and so forth.
Okay, I have a question over here.
I am a high school student, and I'm here today as part of the Sunrise Movement, a youth-led climate justice movement. I would like to first of all thank you so much for being a climate leader over the years, particularly in your work on clean transportation and sustainable infrastructure, and your co-sponsorship of the Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act. We're asking that they sign the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge. Over 200 politicians from all over the country have already signed, and I would like you to sign as well. So it reads, I pledge not to take contributions. So will you sign the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge?
Which says that I won't take money from fossil fuel companies?
Yeah.
Sure, I don't get any anyway.
We probably have questions for maybe one more question.
Hello, my name is Rosalie. I live on the west side. I would like to know if your committee has been advised which several states' voter registration rolls were penetrated by
Okay, the answer is no, we have not.
Will there be further hearings when you might be?
We have, it was announced that 21 states were hacked, attempted to be hacked. It was also announced by the head of cybersecurity for the, I forget which agency, but the head of cybersecurity, that a small number of states were penetrated and 5 were infiltrated. I don't know the difference between penetrated and infiltrated, but 5 named states were infiltrated, a small number were penetrated. We don't know which were penetrated. We have demanded, we have asked the chairman, I signed a letter last week demanding hearings on this, emergency hearings on this. I don't expect them to say yes. But again, we don't control the agenda. We can't issue subpoenas. It's up to the Republicans because they're in control at least till January.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this evening. We will have more town hall, but please give us these pieces of paper so we can get us your writing.